The first chill of autumn had found its way into Oxford that evening, though it carried itself with the politeness of an uninvited guest, unsure whether to stay. From my corner table at the White Horse, I could hear the muted scrape of cutlery from a couple finishing their supper and the faint susurration of the wind outside, carrying with it the wet smell of rain lingering on the cobbles. I'd taken my time over the pint, the amber head had long since collapsed, and allowed the crossword to unfold at its usual reluctant pace. One clue had proved irritatingly obstinate. Morning view, it read, 5.4. I'd circled it 3 times as though repetition might coax it into surrender. It didn't. Instead, my eyes had wandered to the window where the street lamps on Magdalen Bridge had begun to glow, their reflection trembling on the surface of the Cherwell in narrow golden ribbons. Beyond, the tower stood aloof against the bruised sky, patient and knowing, as if it had seen far more than it ever intended to tell. The barmaid passed, her arms loaded with glasses, and the smell of hops followed her. I let the pencil rest against my thumb. The clue's words felt like a small stone in the shoe, the kind of detail that insists on notice without explaining why. Perhaps it was the hour, or the creeping dusk, but the phrase began to taste of absence. Lewis arrived with the unhurried heaviness of a man who'd been told not to disturb me, and had decided to ignore the instruction. He slid into the chair opposite, setting a thin brown file between us. The paper inside, I noticed, was bent at the corner, as though thumbed one time too many. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said, his voice lowered as if the walls might be listening. "An anonymous letter. Came in this morning." I opened it. The sheet was typewritten, the sort of mechanical imprint that carries no hint of the hand that guided it. The spacing was uneven, the ribbon ink faint in places. It said only this: "A widow walks in silence by the river, carrying a debt unpaid. No signature, no return address, no date." I let it rest in my hands, feeling the smoothness of the paper's grain. I could see Lewis watching me, waiting for some pronouncement. I told him it sounded fanciful, a fragment torn from some half-forgotten novel. The city had no shortage of its own ghost stories, most of them told with far more conviction. Still, something in the phrasing made me resist returning it at once. Silence by the river. It carried a precision that felt deliberate, not poetic flourish. And a debt unpaid could mean anything from an unsettled account to something darker, heavier, unspoken. Lewis sipped the pint I'd pushed toward him and said nothing more. Outside, a cyclist crossed the bridge, their headlamp cutting briefly through the mist rising from the water. I found my gaze following that thin line of light until it vanished into the high street. I told him to leave the file, for form's sake, of course. The kind of thing one might mention over coffee and then forget by supper. But the words had already begun to work in the way certain songs do. They lodged themselves in a corner of the mind, replaying without invitation. When Lewis had gone, I returned to the crossword. The clue still waited, patient as ever. Morning view. The answer came not with triumph, but with the quiet inevitability of a tide. Dead calm. It was almost disappointing in its simplicity. Yet even as I penciled it in, I found my mind back on the bridge, on the imagined figure of a woman walking slowly by the Cherwell. The river would hold its secrets as rivers do, but secrets, like debts, have a way of surfacing when the light is just about to fade. The telephone woke me at an hour I have always regarded as inhospitable to human reason. Lewis's voice, low and matter-of-fact, asked if I might be persuaded to walk to St. Hilda's without my breakfast. It was the sort of request one makes knowing full well the answer, though I found myself agreeing before I'd properly swung my legs from the bed. The morning had the pale light of a page left too long in the sun. Down by the river, the willows drooped into the water as though conspiring with the current. St. Hilda's stood with its usual quiet dignity, the scent of damp brickwork rising where the lawns had drunk last night's rain. Lewis met me at the gate, his coat already carrying the garden's cool breath. He said only, "Fellow's garden," and led the way. Mrs. Eleanor Fairfax lay on the grass as though she had sat down for a moment's rest and forgotten to rise. She was perhaps in her late 60s, though the lines of her face spoke more of thought than of time. A retired lecturer in literature, Lewis told me, and recently widowed, her husband a historian of some renown in Oxford's cloisters. Her head was turned slightly to the right, and though no wound declared itself, there was a shadow at the temple, the kind one might gain from a careless knock or a hand that knew precisely where to fall. On a bench nearby rested an open volume of Keats, its pages stippled with rain. The words, faint in the morning light, seemed to belong more to the air than to the paper. Beside it, a wine-glass, the last inch of claret catching the light in a way that made it look warmer than the day deserved. The porter who had found her stood a few yards off, his cap in his hands. Lewis coaxed from him a halting account. He had passed through the garden on his way back from locking the gates around 10. There had been a sound, faint, hesitant, almost like humming. Schubert, he thought, though he admitted he could not name the piece. The tune had followed him only as far as the turning toward the main quad, where it dissolved into the wind. I bent over the book. The page was open to a sonnet, not one of Keats's most famous, but the words lingered on loss, on beauty departing before it is understood. The rain had softened the ink at the edges, as if attempting to return it to the earth. Lewis asked if I thought she had drunk alone. I said nothing at first. The glass bore no lipstick mark, though her mouth, faintly coloured still, suggested she might have worn some. The wine had been poured generously, but not extravagantly, the measure of someone with a conversation to keep company. From the far side of the lawn a blackbird scolded us, its voice sharp against the muffled quiet. I looked again at the bruise. A fool could have done it, certainly, though the grass beneath her showed no sign of struggle, no scuff of a heel or tear in the fabric of her coat. Lewis mentioned the letter from the night before, a widow by the river. I reminded him that coincidences in Oxford have a talent for dressing themselves as portents, yet I could not help recalling the image that had wandered into my thoughts at the White Horse, a solitary figure, the water carrying away whatever words she would not say aloud. We stood there a while longer. The college walls seemed to keep the world at bay, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves and the smell of wet stone. Somewhere, beyond the reach of the Cherwell's slow turning, Schubert might still have been playing, though whether for the living or the dead, I could not. The provost of St. Hilda's was a man of neat hands and a manner that gave the impression of perpetual rehearsal. We sat in his panelled study, where the faint aroma of beeswax hovered above the darker scent of old paper. Through the leaded windows the garden lay in quiet retreat from the business of the city, though the bench with its rain-spotted book was just visible, an unwanted punctuation in the green. Mrs. Fairfax, he began, was kind, reserved, and entirely unremarkable. The pause before that last word was almost imperceptible, but it was there, like the catch of a fingernail on an old record. I let the silence stretch, knowing the temptation it offers to the conscience. He added after a moment that she had been private to a fault, declining most invitations beyond her own circle, and rarely lingering after formal dinners. When I asked about her recent visitors, he frowned, as though trying to align two halves of an image that would not fit. "The porter keeps a register," he said finally, "if that would be of use." Lewis and I walked to the lodge, its low rooms smelling of rain-damp coats. The register lay on the desk, its ruled pages filled with a clerk's careful hand. I traced a finger down the recent entries until one caught the eye, not for what it said, but for what it no longer said. A name had been overwritten in a heavier ink, the strokes slightly awkward, as though the writer were unused to deception. Beneath, the faint ghost of letters remained, pressed into the page by the weight of the nib. I tilted the book towards the light. The indentations spoke in silence, the curves and stems of the original name just visible if one knew to. Look, I could not yet read it, but I recognized the rhythm of the letters, a name neither short nor long, but of a length that leaves space for concealment. The porter, a man with a face carved into permanent neutrality, offered no help. "Ink blot," he said, as if the past could be so easily smudged away. Lewis closed the register with the caution one gives to a fragile object and handed it back. Eleanor's rooms had been cleared only of the body, the rest remained untouched. The air inside was cool, carrying the scent of lavender water and the faint metallic tang of old radiators. On the desk, a neat stack of correspondence lay tied with blue ribbon, but it was a photograph in a shallow drawer that held my attention. It was black and white, its edges curled, the gloss dulled with decades. 4 young women stood in a college quad, their coats buttoned against what must have been an early spring chill. 3 looked directly at the camera, faces open, the kind of confidence youth mistakes for permanence. The 4th was blurred, caught mid-turn, her features dissolving into motion, as if she had been startled or had decided too late against being seen. There was something in the composition, the faintly conspiratorial tilt of the other's shoulders, the way the blurred figure's arm hung not quite in step with her companion's, that hinted at a story the image had been too slow to catch. Lewis asked if I thought the photograph mattered. I told him everything matters until it doesn't. He smiled, the way one does when humour and discomfort meet in equal measure. Back outside, the afternoon light was softening, and the first lamps along the path were beginning to glow. St. Hilda's, for all its modernity, seemed to carry a thin seam of the past beneath its surface, like a whisper in the fabric. A college of ghosts, if one cared to see them, and perhaps one had the night before by the river. The senior common room at St. Hilda's smelled faintly of coffee gone tepid and the slow decay of leather bindings. Its tall windows admitted a wintry light that flattened the room's colours to something approaching monochrome, as if it too were a photograph waiting to fade. I've always thought that in such rooms people try a little too hard to be themselves. Dr. Margaret Ingham was first to join us. She had the kind of poise that is both armour and weapon, and a voice like a scalpel, precise, leaving little to linger on. Eleanor, she said, had been dedicated. The pause seemed to weigh more than the word itself. They had worked together for 2 decades, and she admitted with a cool smile that they had not always agreed. I wondered what form disagreement took in such a climate. Sharp memos, barbed compliments, the long glacial silences of the academic corridor. When I mentioned the photograph, the corner of her mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. No, she didn't recall it being taken. Professor Julian Harcourt arrived. Next, his gown hanging like a flag after a long campaign. He was an aging classicist with a fondness for phrases that outstayed their welcome, and his breath carried a whisper of last night's wine. Eleanor was charming, he said, but inclined towards solitude. He had been dining in Balliol on the evening in question, and would happily provide names. I noticed, however, that his eyes drifted towards the drinks cabinet when the photograph lay on the table, as though the image required a fortification he did not have to hand. Simon Fairfax appeared without invitation, filling the doorway in a suit that suggested both means and a slight disdain for tailoring. His stepmother had, he said, complicated his father's final years, and his will. He had been in London when she died, attending a meeting about property he declined to describe in detail. The photograph, when shown to him, was met with a frown so quick it might have been no more than the adjustment of a thought. He claimed not to know any of the young women depicted, yet his gaze lingered a fraction too long on the blurred figure, as if it contained a private recognition. Rachel Willoughby was last, younger than the others, though her face bore the restless exhaustion of someone accustomed to chasing a living through words alone. A poet of some promise, she admitted to owing Eleanor a modest sum, a loan she had been unable to repay. On the night of the death she had been reading at a small literary gathering in Jericho. Several could confirm it. She looked at the photograph longer than the rest, tracing the edges with a finger, as if testing the fragility of the paper. "I think I was there that day," she said, "but I can't be sure. The blurred girl. She moved like someone I once knew." Lewis and I sat after they had gone, the empty cups before us cooling into small mirrors. Each had offered a plausible alibi, polished and ready for presentation, but each had also, in their own way, flinched at the photograph's intrusion. Outside, the cloistered air of the college gave way to the cold. The lamps along the path were already lit, their halos smudged by a thin mist rising from the river. I thought of the unnamed woman in the photograph, her motion blurred as if she had been on the point of leaving the frame entirely. It struck me then that perhaps she had, and that all of them, in their different ways, were still following her out of it. Eleanor's private library occupied a narrow upstairs room, where the windows faced east and the light fell with the pallor of milk. The air smelled of polished oak, and the faint, acrid ghost of dust disturbed. Her shelves were orderly without being mechanical, books grouped by instinct rather than classification. I moved my hand along the spines, feeling the ridges and softening cloth bindings, the years caught in their creases. It was Lewis who noticed the thin, worn volume pushed back a little deeper than the others. The Widow of Windsor. I doubted even the more devoted Victorianists in Oxford would have recalled it without prompting. A slender, long-forgotten verse collection published in 1864, the sort of earnest sentimentality that had withered in the harsher air of later decades. The book fell open easily in my hands, as though it had been handled often. The margins were crowded with Eleanor's handwriting, a slanted, deliberate script. At first glance, the notes seemed no more than the fussy interventions of an academic unwilling to let the author's words stand alone. Comments on metre, references to other poets, small arrows drawing connections between themes of loss and endurance. Yet patterns have a way of announcing themselves if one lingers long enough. Certain initials appeared repeatedly, not those of the poet, nor of any critic I could recall, set down without explanation in the same looping capitals. J.H., R.W., S.F., M.I. Others too, but those four most often. Between them numbers, 7, 12, 3, always in the margin, sometimes beneath a line, sometimes beside it. I counted lines in one poem where 7 appeared. The 7th line, a fragment about a debt of the heart, carried an underlining so faint it might have been accidental. In another, 12 corresponded to a line about the sound of water carrying secrets downstream. A code, then, but one without a key, at least for now. Lewis, patient in his way, had been leafing through the front matter. He tapped the end paper with the back of his pen. "You'll like this," he said. There was a small inked stamp of the saint, Hilda's college library, and beneath it a date, 14th May, 1972. The borrower's name had been neatly excised, the paper cut away with the precision of someone who understood the value of absence. He'd been to the lodge that morning, and curiosity had drawn him into the library's loan records. The entry for that day existed still, but the borrower's name had been overwritten, not with a later hand, but erased entirely from the carbon copy. The catalogue now listed the book as borrowed by a visiting academic, with no further detail. 1972. I thought of the photograph in my pocket. 4 women, one blurred in motion, and felt the stubborn weight of something that had been quietly left to mature over decades. The initials in the margins could be theirs, or their echoes. But whose hand had set them down? Eleanor's, years after that spring, or someone else's entirely? Lewis suggested we might find a library assistant from those years still in Oxford, the sort of long-serving custodian who recalls not only faces but the particular way they signed their names. I told him to try. The book lay on the desk between us, its Victorian earnestness concealing whatever small map it carried. Outside, the college gardens were caught between sun and shadow, the wind shifting the branches so that patches of light moved like restless thoughts across the grass. I closed the volume and slid it into my bag. Codes are like debts, I thought. They wait without complaint, certain that one day someone will have to reckon with them. The fellow's wine cellar lay beneath a low arch, its air cool and still, holding the scent of cork and damp stone. Dust clung to the bottle racks in soft grey fur, disturbed only where recent hands had reached. It was Lewis who found it, a Burgundy, 1969, the bottle lying awkwardly apart from its fellows, the label faded to a ghost of its former self. The fingerprint powder on its green glass revealed a tidy constellation belonging to Julian Harcourt. We called him to account in the SCR, where the day's light fell thinly through high windows and turned the dust motes into slow, deliberate dancers. Harcourt eased himself into a chair as though it had been made for someone taller. He did not deny it. Yes, he'd shared the bottle with Eleanor. 2 nights before she died. A pleasant evening, he said, with the air of someone determined to keep it so in recollection. They had spoken of the early days, of friends now gone, of scholars whose arguments had outlived their authors. She was perfectly well when we parted, he told me, and for once the phrase did not feel rehearsed. He had seen her to the gate, and she had refused his offer to walk her home. A light rain had begun then, and she had drawn her coat tighter, stepping into the night with the purposeful gait of someone who still had tasks to complete. It was Lewis who wondered aloud about poison, the simplest of devices, and one that could easily hide in the bouquet of an old wine. Harcourt took this with a certain resigned elegance, Neither offended nor particularly interested. "I am still here, Inspector," he said dryly, as if this alone were an argument in his favour. The toxicology report came back sooner than expected. No trace of anything beyond the usual: tannins, sediment, the benign residue of a wine that had survived its half-century in decent condition. No alkaloids, no metals, nothing that would justify the suspicion. For a short time, I had almost wanted the theory to be true. There is a neatness in the notion of a poisoned glass, an intimacy, a sense of the past slipping quietly into the present to settle its accounts. But the report returned us to the far less satisfying truth. The wine was fine, and the bottle, for all Harcourt's fingerprints, was merely the relic of an evening untouched by crime. Or so the evidence insisted. Still, there was a detail that nagged. The bottle had not been returned to its proper place, nor left somewhere obvious for disposal. It had been set apart, as though waiting to be found, or avoided. Harcourt claimed it was absent-mindedness. He had meant to bring it up from the cellar for the steward to note, but had forgotten. I've known men to remember far less in the company of wine, so I did not press. When we left, the porter was locking the gates against the early dark. The river was restless under the bridge, swollen by the week's rain. I thought of Eleanor walking home that night, the echo of Harcourt's voice still in her ears, perhaps with the taste of Burgundy lingering. Perfectly well, he had said, and perhaps she had been, yet the bottle remained in my mind, not for what it had contained, but for the quiet, deliberate it was a wet evening, the kind where the rain never quite commits to falling, but hangs in the air like an unspoken doubt. I had taken Rachel Willoughby's latest collection down from the shelf, intending only to glance at it before bed. The book smelled faintly of new paper, the spine resisting at first, then yielding as though resigned to what was coming. The dedication caught me immediately, for Eleanor, who knew the cost of words. It was the kind of line that could be affectionate or accusatory, depending on the day. I turned the pages slowly, my eyes catching on an epigraph before one of the central poems. "The river knows the widow's grief." It was familiar in a way that made my skin itch, not from Rachel's hand, but from somewhere far older, an 1890s poet, little read now, who had written of widowers, not widows. A man's grief, particular and sharp in its solitude, not the feminine sorrow Rachel had rendered. It was a small change, but small changes in poetry are often where the trouble begins. When I saw her the next day, she was sitting in the cafe near the Bodleian, the steam from her cup curling into the air as though attempting to escape. I asked her about the line, and her eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were measuring the ground between confession and defiance. "I thought it was better that way," she said at last. "More universal." Eleanor didn't agree, I suggested. The reaction was almost imperceptible, a tightening at the corner of her mouth. She corrected me once, rather fiercely actually, told me I should let the dead speak in their own voices. I asked if it had been a quarrel. She shook her head, though the denial felt constructed. When I pressed, gently, about the night of Eleanor's death, Rachel hesitated. She looked at the window rather than at me, as if the rain there might be an easier companion than my gaze. "I went to see her," she admitted finally. "Late. I'd been at the Jericho reading, but afterward, I thought I might speak to her, about the book, about money." "And did you?" "Number I?" I heard her crying, not loud, just enough. I stood outside the door for a bit, then I left. She never knew I was there. There was a pause in which the clink of a spoon in another cup seemed indecently loud. I asked if she had seen anyone else that night. She shook her head. I didn't look. Her tone had the same quality as the misquote, deliberate but with a faintly false note beneath it. People rarely change words in poetry by accident, just as they rarely omit details of an evening without reason. When I left the cafe, the rain had begun in earnest, tapping against the hoods of bicycles left chained along the railings. I thought of the river line again. The river knows the widow's grief. Perhaps Rachel had believed it truer that way, or perhaps she had been echoing something Eleanor herself had said. The correction, the fierceness. Those belonged to a woman for whom precision was more than habit. It was survival. The path back toward Magdalen took me over the bridge. The lamps glowed dimly in the damp air, their reflections shivering in the Cherwell. I tried to imagine Eleanor crying in her rooms, the sound slipping through the closed door, carrying itself like the river's current, away from the source, towards some darker confluence where it would not be heard again. Ask ChatGPT away it had been set apart, a note struck in a key we had not yet learned to hear. Simon Fairfax arrived at the station in a storm of tweed and indignation, carrying an envelope as if it might scorch him should he hold it too long. He placed it on my desk without sitting down. Inside was a solicitor's letter, the sort of formal language that seems determined to conceal more than it reveals. The draft, will it enclosed, stated in no uncertain terms that Eleanor Fairfax intended to leave the bulk of her estate to Rachel Willoughby, and nothing to Simon. "You see the motive, don't you, Inspector?" he said, his voice taut with the effort of controlled outrage. Clear as day. She was going to cut me out, hand it all to some penniless poet who could barely keep herself in paper and ink. Lewis, standing by the filing cabinet, gave me a look over the edge of the document. Rachel's name was indeed there, in neat type, the principal beneficiary. It would have been easy to accept Simon's presentation. Too easy. I asked him where the will had been found. With her solicitor, of course. The man had called him, distressed, wanting to know what to do. I imagined the solicitor's distress had deepened after that call. Something about the paper's freshness made me pause. The ink was crisp, the typing clean, without the faint bleed of older ribbons. I glanced at the date. It was there, unobtrusive in the top right corner, and it was wrong, by a day. Not the day before Eleanor died, but the day after. I slid the paper back into its envelope and looked at Simon. "Did it not strike you," I asked, "that drafting a will the day after one's own death is rather a feat?" He hesitated. The pause was not long, but long enough to register as thought being rearranged into explanation. "The solicitor must have made a mistake," he said. I pressed softly. By the time we sat in the solicitor's office, a room that smelled faintly of dry ink and older failures, the truth came out with less resistance than I expected. Simon had asked him to prepare the document posthumously. To avoid family scandal, as he put it, he wished to imply that Rachel had a financial motive. He admitted, not without discomfort, that there was no such will during Eleanor's lifetime. The solicitor, a man whose pinstripe suit seemed to sag under the weight of his own compliance, said he had agreed out of misguided loyalty to the Fairfax family. It was not, he said, intended for the police. Only for private clarity. Simon's jaw set at that. Private clarity is a useful phrase for those hoping to obscure public dishonesty. I asked if he had considered the effect such a document might have on Rachel's life. His silence was the answer. When he left, Lewis closed the door and muttered something about people poisoning wells they've no intention of drinking from. The metaphor was apt. The false will had been a red herring of the more elaborate sort, dressed in legal formality, wrapped in family resentment, yet still reeking when held too close. I filed it away, not because it was useful to the case, but because such things have a habit of resurfacing when one least expects them. The date, that small, stubborn detail, had been its undoing. In my experience, people remember to lie about the large things. It's the small truths they forget to disguise. That night, crossing the bridge toward home, the rain had stopped and the river lay dark and still beneath the lamps. No widow, no mourner walked there now. Only the water, carrying whatever it had been given. The Bodleians' reading room was as still as an abandoned cloister. Morse sat before the terminal, the grainy student photograph glowing faintly on the monitor. For 2 days he had lived with its blurred mystery, the indistinct shape on the far right teasing him like an unsolved cryptic. Now, with the assistance of a patient technician from the library's digitization department, the negative was reversed, the shadows swapped for light. The face emerged slowly, almost reluctantly from the inversion, the lines soft, the hair thick, the eyes alive with youth. Morse's breath caught. There was no mistaking it. Julian Harcourt, 30 years younger, dressed in a dark blazer and striped tie, a glass raised in mid-toast. Harcourt, the weary, wine-sodden don of today, had once been handsome, even rakish. It was the other details that set Morse's mind working. Behind Harcourt, the blurred outline of a banner stretched across the college quad. The Widows' Walk Society, 1968. The letters were uneven, perhaps hand-painted, but the words were legible enough. Morse felt a spark of recognition, not from the photograph, but from the crossword clue that had begun this entire chain of thought. Widow's Walk. At the time, it had seemed little more than an idle challenge from Eleanor's restless intellect. Now it felt like a breadcrumb, deliberately left for him to follow. He jotted a note in his pad. Private club? Students plus staff? Political? Lewis leaned over his shoulder. "Never heard of it," he said, squinting at the screen. "That's because you didn't haunt the wrong corners of Oxford in the late 60s, Morse murmured. The Widow's Walk was, well, not quite a political cell, not quite a literary salon. A hybrid of the two. They read poetry, yes, but they also debated Rhodesian sanctions, Vietnam, Northern Ireland. Students adored it. The dean despised it. You were here in 68, sir? I was here in spirit, Lewis. And spirits, for that matter, Morse said, but his eyes never left Harcourt's youthful face. Eleanor was here too, a second-year student, English faculty. Brilliant. Too brilliant to be left alone. A memory surfaced, something Harcourt had said in passing, about knowing Eleanor back in the day, as if those days were a series of quaint sherry evenings. Yet here was proof that their connection had been forged in something more dangerous than faculty common rooms. If the Widows' Walk Society had been as politically tinged as Morse suspected, then any surviving ties from that period might be built on shared secrets, or shared guilt. Morse pushed back from the desk. We'll need the Society's membership list, assuming one exists. Lewis looked doubtful. From 40 years ago? If it was unofficial. That's the point, Morse cut in. If it was unofficial, any record that does exist will have been hidden deliberately, and hidden things are worth finding. On their way out of the archives, Morse detoured to the librarian's office. The head archivist, a thin man with wire spectacles, listened without surprise. Widow's Walk? Oh yes, caused quite the stir. Died out after 69. Some said the proctors closed it down. Others claimed it simply disbanded. He tapped pencil thoughtfully. I recall that Eleanor Whitcomb was a leading light in its final year. Harcourt too, though he liked to keep that quiet in later life. Morse thanked him, but in truth his mind was already elsewhere, on Eleanor's choice to reference Widow's Walk in a crossword clue sent days before her death. Was it a message, a warning, or an accusation meant for Harcourt's eyes? That night, in the dim light of his flat, Morse poured a single measure of whiskey and spread his notes across the table. The photograph lay at the centre, Harcourt's young face looking out from history framed by the words Widow's Walk. The date, the politics, the personal connections, all pointed to a shared past that Eleanor had not forgotten, nor, Morse suspected, forgiven. Zrenia and holding tight was Lewis, who fetched the Keats. He had been working his way, patiently, doggedly, through Eleanor's shelves, putting each book back in its place, as if the crime scene itself might object to any disorder. Morse took the slim, faded volume absently, more to relieve himself of Lewis's earnest hovering than from any particular plan. The book was the 1921 Oxford edition, calf-bound, the kind a bibliophile might have bought for pleasure rather than scholarship. The leather was supple and warm to the touch, and the gold-leaf title was worn almost to nothing. As Morse idly flicked the pages, his thumb caught on a place where two leaves were fractionally misaligned. A faint whisper of torn paper reached his ear. He froze. Gently, he examined the edge. Not torn, but cut. The slit was deliberate, running along the inner fold of the page as neatly as a surgeon's incision. He pressed the spine flat and teased the leaves apart. Something thin and metallic slid against the paper. It was a small brass key. Not new, but polished smooth by decades of handling. "Lewis?" Morse said, his voice low. Lewis bent over. "Well, that's not for the gas meter." "No." Morse weighed it in his palm. Desk, drawer, perhaps something locked away for decades. People always think they can lock the past away. They never can. The key was, in fact, a perfect fit for the lower right-hand drawer of Eleanor's writing desk. The lock turned with a satisfying click, releasing the scent of cedar and old ink. Inside lay neat bundles of correspondence, tied with ribbon, Eleanor's looping hand on each label. and a single envelope without address or stamp. Morse lifted it. The flap had been sealed and then carefully slit, as though opened in private and replaced in precisely the same position. The paper inside was thick, cream-laid, and written in Eleanor's unmistakable script. It was addressed, in the salutation only, to Julian. The tone was neither affectionate nor casual. Each sentence was edged with a controlled bitterness that seemed to pulse through the loops of her penmanship. You have never understood, Julian, how thoroughly you betrayed us all. It was not only her you abandoned that night, but the very thing we believed in. For years I have kept your secret. Perhaps I was complicit by my silence. But the time for silence is over. Morse read on, his eyes narrowing. The her was unnamed, but the letter hinted, obliquely, devastatingly, at a mutual friend, a fifth member of something Eleanor called the Society, a woman who had walked into the river in the spring of 1970. Eleanor claimed she had proof that Julian's actions, or his cowardice, had driven her there. The last lines were cold as glass. You cannot undo the past, but you can face it. I shall see to that. Lewis exhaled softly. Not much love lost there. Morse folded the letter carefully. Love's opposite isn't hate, Lewis. It's indifference. And Eleanor, to the last, was not indifferent. He placed the letter beside the brass key on the blotter. Pieces of the puzzle were shifting, the photograph, the crossword clue, the name of the society, the Widow's Walk. The name itself was an image, a place where one stands to watch for a ship that will never return. A literary club, perhaps, but with undercurrents of politics and personal loyalty, the sort of youthful idealism that might curdle into bitterness when betrayed. And Eleanor, it seemed, had nursed that. Bitterness for half a lifetime. Morse straightened, the Keats still open at its slit page. The dead, he thought, often leave their keys in the wrong places, and sometimes it takes the living a very long time to notice. He rested in silence. The fellow's garden was almost deserted. August light fell long and gold across the worn grass, catching on the surface of the slow, green river beyond the yews. Morse stood with his hands in his pockets, as though he had been waiting there for hours. Julian Harcourt approached with the careful dignity of a man determined not to seem hurried. His blazer, even in the warmth, was buttoned tight, his tie a dark, sober blue. "You said you wanted to speak privately," he murmured, not meeting Morse's eyes. Morse nodded toward the bench by the water. "I think this is as private as we'll get." Harcourt sat stiffly. Morse remained standing, looking out at the sluggish current. "I've been thinking about Eleanor's copy of Keats, about the letter she never sent, about the Widow's Walk Society, and what it meant to all of you." Harcourt's hands tightened on his knees. "That was a very long time ago." Not so long that Eleanor forgot. Morse's tone was mild, but his gaze, when it fell on Harcourt, was unblinking. "She wanted to tell the truth about 1970, about what you did to your mutual friend, the one who didn't survive it." Harcourt flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "We were foolish, cruel in that thoughtless, youthful way. I didn't kill her, Morse, any more than I killed Eleanor." "That's the thing, Harcourt. I believe you." Morse's voice was quieter now, almost conversational. "But you lied. You hid things. You left her there." The older man looked up sharply. "You quarrelled with her," Morse continued. "Something about the past. Perhaps she accused you outright. You left in temper, or shame, or both. And then, on the damp stone path in the garden, she fell." Harcourt's mouth worked as though to deny it, but no words came. Finally he spoke, and the voice was different, lower, stripped of bluster. "It was raining earlier that evening. The stones were slick. She followed me to the gate, still arguing, and her foot went out from under her. I saw her head strike the edge of the step. The sound—" He stopped, swallowing. "I ran to her. She was breathing, but unconscious. I panicked." "Why not call for help?" He gave a bitter, humourless laugh. "You've lived in Oxford long enough, Morse. You know what whispers do. A late-night quarrel. My name, her name. The past dragged out again. I thought, idiot that I am, that I could arrange things. So you moved her to the bench? Yes, she always liked that bench. I put the Keats beside her so it would look, well, peaceful. Then I left. I told myself she would wake, go inside, and no one would be the wiser. But she didn't wake. No. Harcourt's gaze drifted to the water, where the afternoon sun shimmered in long, trembling lines. The next morning, it was too late. And the rest? Morse asked. The missing records, the rumours, the will? All to keep the past buried. Harcourt gave a faint, almost incredulous shake of the head. Fairfax with his forged letter, Rachel with her misquoted poems. We were all lying, in our different ways, not about killing her, but about what we were, what we'd done. For a long time they sat in silence, save for the muted rush of the weir and the rustle of leaves overhead. A rowing eight passed in the distance, the oars dipping with mechanical precision. "You've told me the truth now," Morse said at last, "such as it is." Harcourt closed his eyes briefly. "Does it make a difference?" Morse did not answer at once. He looked at the old man's profile, lined, proud, and defeated, and thought of Eleanor's letter in its neat, unsent envelope, of the decades that had passed between 1968 and now, carrying their freight of silences. "It might," Morse said quietly. "Not in the way you think, but it might." And then he left Harcourt there by the river, alone with the sunlight and the slow water, while the shadows of the yews crept gradually toward the bench where Eleanor had been found. It was a small, tidy paragraph in the Oxford Times the following morning. "Inquest concludes accidental death. Eleanor Willoughby, age 71, of St. John's College, suffered fatal injuries after a fall on the Fellows' garden path. No suspicious circumstances found. A few lines to close a lifetime. No mention of the letters, the key in the Keats, the false will, or the shameful little society that had bound and broken its members over half a century." By mid-afternoon the Willoughby household was locked, its blinds drawn, and Simon Fairfax had retreated to London with a solicitor in tow. Rachel Willoughby, too, had vanished from Oxford. The porter at Somerville told Morse she had gone abroad for a bit. Julian Harcourt was still in residence, but Morse suspected the man would soon find himself on leave, as the college delicately put it, when a fellow was encouraged to disappear. The police paperwork was completed, the last of the interviews filed away, and Strange, in a tone that suggested his own relief, said, "That's you done then, Morse. You can get back to your crosswords." But Morse did not go home. The evening found him instead at the King's Arms, where the windows steamed faintly against the cold outside. He took a pint, just the one, and carried it through the back door to the bench that overlooked the Cherwell. It was quiet along the river, as it so often was in that hour between daylight and darkness. The bare willows dipped their thin fingers into the slow water. The punts were drawn up, moored in neat lines like toys left behind by some absent-minded child. The air was cold enough to sting the nose, but still with the faintest smell of damp stone and wood smoke. Morse sat. He thought about Eleanor, her sharp eyes, her precise speech, the way she had left traps for the careless listener. He thought about Harcourt, and the cowardice that could twist a man into silence, and he thought, most uncomfortably, of the Widows' Walk Society, and the girl whose name had not once been spoken during the inquest. The pint went down slowly. From time to time Morse glanced at the far bank, where the towpath curved away towards Magdalen. A woman in black was walking there. She was tall, with her head inclined slightly forward, and her pace was slow but steady. She did not look across at him. For a moment, just a moment, Morse let himself imagine that it was Eleanor herself, unchanged by death, taking the same evening constitutional she might have taken 50 years before. But the figure passed behind the weeping willows, and when she emerged again, she was simply a stranger in a dark coat, heading towards the bridge. He took the folded Times crossword from his coat pocket. It was the same grid he had been working that first morning at the crime scene. Most of it was filled now, the solutions coming to him at odd hours over the last few days. One clue remained. Morning View. 12. He smiled faintly and filled in the letters, neat and square. Widow's Walk. For a while he sat with a completed grid on his knee, the pen resting against the paper. The woman on the towpath had disappeared from sight. Somewhere beyond the bridge a bicycle bell rang. An undergraduate's laughter carried thinly on the air. Morse drained the last of his pint, stood and folded the crossword back into his pocket. The cold had deepened, but the river kept on its way, dark and constant, slipping beneath the bridge towards the unseen Thames. The widow's walk was over, but the widow, in thought, in memory, in grief unspent, still walked.